My name is Jennifer. I am 34. At my brother Connor's Stanford graduation party, my mother Evelyn looked a university department head dead in the face and said, "This is our other daughter. She just washes dishes for a living." We were standing on the manicured lawn of a rented Palo Alto estate. My father, Richard, stood next to her, holding a scotch. He chuckled and told Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of Stanford's clinical psychology department, "We gave up on her years ago. Someone has to scrub the plates." Right? I stood there in my charcoal blazer, bracing for the usual routine. But Dr. Thorne did not laugh. She lowered her glass of sparkling water. She looked at me, then looked at my mother, and delivered the words that permanently dismantled my family's favorite fiction. "Wade, you are Jennifer. The Jennifer." Doctor. Thorne set her glass on a high-top table. "Evelyn, your daughter's Wellness Institute in Sonoma just endowed our department with a $150,000 annual clinical fellowship. She is our premier residency partner. Welcome to Silent Vengeance Stories. If you have ever sat quietly while your relatives narrated a fabricated version of your life to strangers, this story is for you." Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment with your age and where you are listening from. And be sure to hit subscribe. The ambient chatter of the garden party seemed to evaporate. A waiter carrying a tray of crab puffs paused mid-stride. Sensing the drop in atmospheric pressure, Evelyn's mouth opened. But no sound emerged. The blood left her cheeks, turning her expensive foundation into a pale mask. Richard stopped his networking pitch. He stared at the professor, his jaw slacking. For 6 years, my parents had curated a meticulous fiction for their country club associates. They framed me as the destitute failure to make Connor's golden boy narrative shine brighter. Now, the academic elite they worshipped was looking at them as if they were delusional. "Doctor." Thorne tilted her head, her expression turning forensic. "A dishwasher." "Richard." My father swallowed hard. "I think there is a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding." "Doctor," Thorne replied, crisp and measured. "I personally reviewed the grant paperwork yesterday. Her signature is on the endowment. I watched my parents process the collapse of their reality. The superiority they had worn like armor for a decade was crumbling on a rented lawn in Silicon Valley. But I did not deliver a devastating cinematic one-liner. The reality of family trauma is far less polished." As doctor, Thorne waited for my parents to respond. My chest constricted with a familiar suffocating panic. Decades of being the designated scapegoat overrode my professional clinical training. My hands trembled so much that when I reached for my purse, I knocked over my Perrier, shattering the glass across the stone patio. I mumbled an incoherent apology, my face burning with humiliation, and scrambled out through the cedar side gate. There was no triumphant music playing. I simply felt like a terrified child running away. I threw myself into my Subaru Outback and merged onto the 101 freeway heading north toward Sonoma, fighting back hyperventilation. I cranked the air conditioning to numb the sting of tears. I had spent years building a secure, successful life, yet 3 minutes in my parents' presence had reduced me to a stumbling mess. Approaching the Golden Gate Bridge, my phone vibrated furiously in the cup holder. The screen illuminated with a barrage of texts from Connor. He was not checking to see if I was safe. He was begging me to answer his calls, pleading that I not be angry with him, and insisting we needed to talk immediately before our father found out. The sparkling water glass shattering against the Palo Alto flagstone echoed like a gunshot. For a decade, I had counseled patients through severe trauma responses. I wrote peer-reviewed papers on emotional regulation and taught grounding techniques. Yet standing on that rented lawn with Dr. Thorne waiting for my parents to speak, I forgot every single clinical tool I possessed. Decades of conditioned shame hijacked my nervous system. I did not deliver a cinematic comeback. I did not bask in the vindication of my mother losing her color or my father dropping his networking pitch. my chest constricted with a familiar suffocating terror. The wealthy attendees turned their heads toward the noise of the breaking glass. My hands shook terribly as I gripped my purse. I mumbled an incoherent apology, my face burning hot with humiliation, and I bolted. I scrambled through the cedar side gate, leaving the jazz music and the shocked professor behind. I ran down the tree-lined street until I reached my car. There was no triumphant satisfaction. I simply felt like a terrified child who had just broken a rule. I locked the car doors and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I merged onto the northbound freeway, heading toward the Golden Gate Bridge. I cranked the air conditioning to maximum to numb the physical sting of impending tears. Traffic was heavy, typical for a weekend in the Bay Area, and the slow crawl forced me to sit with my own frantic heartbeat. Why did I run? I had built a thriving mental health retreat. I employed 20 licensed clinicians. I was a respected director. But 3 minutes in the presence of Richard and Evelyn had reduced me to a stumbling mess. It is a harsh truth about family dynamics. You can outgrow your hometown. You can out-earn their expectations. But the second you step back into their orbit, you revert to the role they assigned you. They needed me to be the failure. They required my perceived misery to function as the dark backdrop against which Connor could shine as the golden boy. Without my failure, their success felt unmoored. The dishwasher narrative was not pulled from thin air. It was a frozen snapshot of my life from 6 years ago, weaponized to keep me in my place. At 28, I had drained my meager savings to purchase a dilapidated commercial property in agricultural Sonoma. The site was a mess of dry rot and peeling paint, but I saw the vision for a comprehensive wellness retreat. I asked Richard and Evelyn to co-sign a modest renovation loan just to get the foundation poured. They sat in their pristine living room and flatly refused. They mocked my vision as a hippie pipe dream doomed to bankrupt me. To keep the property from falling into foreclosure, while I navigated the grueling California permit process, I kept the site failing roadside cafe operational. I worked 14-hour shifts managing the grill, wiping down sticky vinyl booths, and hauling trash bags to the dumpster. The defining memory of my 20s is scrubbing a commercial grease trap at 2 a.m. My clothes reeked of bleach and rancid fry oil. I was sobbing from sheer exhaustion, my back aching from the concrete floor. My parents visited exactly once during that era. They walked into the cafe, saw me in a stained apron holding a wire sponge, stayed for 12 minutes, and left in disgust. They never returned. They willfully ignored the subsequent grand opening. They ignored the hiring phases, the expansion, the press coverage, and the eventual 8-figure valuation of the retreat. Freezing me in time as a destitute dishwasher protected their fragile worldview. In their minds, anyone who rejected the traditional tech or legal trajectory was destined to live in poverty. They refused to let my success challenge that narrative. If I was successful, it meant they had been wrong to deny me the loan. It meant they had been wrong to dismiss my intelligence. And Richard and Evelyn were never wrong. The orange towers of the Golden Gate Bridge loomed ahead, cutting through the coastal fog. The tires hummed against the metal grating of the bridge, pulling me closer to the safety of Marin County and further away from the disaster in Palo Alto. I needed to get back to my actual life. Running a major clinical facility requires navigating immense bureaucracy. I was currently trapped in a brutal 14-month zoning dispute with the California Coastal Commission fighting for environmental clearance to build a new inpatient wing. I spent my mornings analyzing soil density reports and managing a stalled construction loan. I was a highly competent operator, viewing chaos through the lens of risk management. I had scheduled a meeting for later that afternoon with David, my forensic accountant. David was meticulously auditing the expansion financials to satisfy the state board. He was thorough to a fault, known for finding discrepancies hidden deep in corporate filings. I needed to focus on the blueprints, on the legal battles that actually mattered. I needed to put the ghost of the dishwasher to rest. But family trauma does not adhere to a schedule. Just as I exited the bridge into Sausalito, my phone began to vibrate in the cup holder. It buzzed once, then twice. then erupted into a continuous rhythmic shaking. I glanced down at the screen. A barrage of texts from Connor illuminated the dashboard. He was not checking to see if I had made it to the car safely. He was not apologizing for our parents treating me like dirt in front of his professors. His messages were frantic bursts of pure panic. He begged me to answer his calls. He pleaded with me not to be angry. The final text made the breath catch in my throat. He wrote that we needed to talk immediately before our father found out the truth. He insisted it was a matter of life and death, entirely separate from the graduation party. He demanded we meet in secret, away from the peninsula. He suggested a crowded coffee shop in the Mission District for the following morning. I stared at the glowing screen while the brake lights of the car ahead flared red. The golden boy who had just graduated from Stanford, who was supposedly entering a prestigious tech incubator funded by our father, sounded physically ill through the text messages. A cold dread settled in my stomach, replacing the lingering humiliation of the garden party. Connor was terrified, and whatever he was hiding, it was large enough to bring the entire curated illusion of our family crashing down. I hit the turn signal, gripping the steering wheel tight, and drafted a single-word reply. I sent a single-word reply to Connor and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The screen went dark, but the anxiety radiating from his message lingered in the quiet cabin of my car. Connor was desperate for a lifeline. He assumed I would provide one, because I always absorbed the family damage. As I drove through the foggy hills of Marin County, my mind drifted back to the last time I asked our family for a lifeline. It was 6 years ago. To understand why the dishwasher label my mother weaponized at the graduation party cut so deep, you have to look back to the year I turned 28. I had spent my 20s working clinical hours in fluorescent-lit county facilities, saving every spare dollar I earned. I found a dilapidated commercial property in agricultural Sonoma. The site featured a crumbling main building and a failing roadside diner attached to the front. The paint peeled in long strips and the roof sagged, but the zoning allowed for mixed commercial and medical use. I drafted a 70-page business plan for a comprehensive mental health retreat. I needed a modest renovation loan to break ground. I sat in my parents' pristine Palo Alto living room with the blueprints spread across their glass coffee table. Richard glanced at my financial projections for 3 seconds before pushing the binder away. He called the clinic a hippie pipe dream. He stated the only investments worth making were in software or intellectual property. Evelyn sipped her iced tea and advised me to drop the nonsense and apply for an entry-level human resources job at a real tech firm. When I asked them to merely co-sign the bank loan, giving me the leverage I needed to start construction, they flatly refused. They said they would not attach their pristine credit to a doomed endeavor. I scraped together every cent I owned and secured a high-interest commercial loan just to acquire the deed. Then the reality of California bureaucracy hit. The county permit process stalled. The environmental reviews dragged on for months. I had a large monthly mortgage due and a clinic that existed only on paper. To keep the property from falling into foreclosure, I had no choice but to keep the attached failing roadside cafe operational. I traded my clinical blazer for a canvas apron. I worked 14-hour shifts 7 days a week. I managed the flat-top grill flipping burgers and burning my forearms on popping grease. I hauled heavy black trash bags to the dumpster in the sweltering afternoon heat. I learned how to unclog industrial sinks and balance a cash register on zero sleep. The defining memory of that era occurred on a Tuesday at 2 a.m. I was on my hands and knees on cracked linoleum, scrubbing out the commercial grease trap. The smell of rancid oil and industrial bleach burned my lungs. My fingernails were cracked and packed with grime. I was sobbing from pure physical exhaustion, wondering if Richard and Evelyn had been right. I felt entirely broken. The next afternoon, my parents visited the property for the first and only time. They did not call ahead. They simply arrived in their luxury sedan, stepping onto the gravel parking lot in designer shoes. I was behind the counter wiping down a sticky vinyl booth. I wore a grease-stained apron holding a wire sponge. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about the status of the clinic permits. She looked at the smudged windows, the cheap laminated menus, and the sweat on my forehead. Her expression was not one of maternal concern. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at me as if I had intentionally chosen a life of squalor just to embarrass her. Richard stood beside her, checking his watch. He muttered something about the smell of frying oil ruining his suit. They stayed for exactly 12 minutes. They ordered nothing. They offered no help. They walked back to their car and drove away. They never returned. That 12-minute visit became the permanent snapshot they used to define my entire existence. They willfully ignored everything that happened next. They ignored the day the county finally approved my zoning permits. They ignored the grand opening of the retreat a year later. They never acknowledged the hiring of 20 licensed clinicians or the landscaping of the meditation gardens. When a regional business journal featured my institute valuing the operation in the 8 figures, my parents acted as if the publication did not exist. It took me years of my own therapy to understand why. Freezing me in time as a destitute dishwasher was a defense mechanism. It protected their fragile worldview. In their minds, anyone who rejected the traditional Silicon Valley trajectory was destined to live in poverty. A daughter choosing wellness and agriculture over code and corporate law had to fail for their life choices to remain superior. If they acknowledged my success, they would have to acknowledge their own lack of vision. They preferred the comfortable lie of my failure over the undeniable truth of my achievement. I pressed my foot on the accelerator, leaving the memories behind as I crossed into Sonoma County. The fog lifted, revealing the rolling vineyards bathed in the late afternoon sun. I was returning to a reality they refused to see, but the peace of the drive was deceptive. Running a high-volume clinical facility involves navigating a relentless stream of logistical hurdles. The cafe was long gone, replaced by a serene reception building, but my current battles were fought in municipal offices. I was trapped in a grueling 14-month zoning dispute with the California Coastal Commission. My clinic required a new inpatient wing to meet patient demand, but local environmental boards were stalling the expansion. My mornings consisted of reading dense soil reports and managing a stalled construction loan that drained resources. I approached these challenges with a cool, analytical detachment. I viewed emotional chaos through the same lens I used for risk management, separating the noise from the facts. Pulling into the private driveway of my retreat, I parked my car and took a deep breath of the eucalyptus-scented air. The crisp smell cleared the lingering tension of Palo Alto from my senses. I needed to shift gears immediately. David, my forensic accountant, was waiting for me in my office. We had a scheduled meeting to audit the expansion financials to satisfy the state board. David possessed a meticulous eye, known for finding discrepancies hidden deep in corporate filings. I grabbed my tote bag and walked toward the glass doors of the main building. The pristine lobby hummed with quiet efficiency. I nodded to my front desk manager and walked down the hall to my suite. Before I could even open the door, my phone vibrated again. It was another message from Connor. His desperation was escalating. He texted that his investors were asking questions he could not answer. He begged me to confirm our secret meeting in the Mission District for the following day. The contrast was stark. I was walking into a meeting to authorize a multi-million-dollar architectural expansion, while my brother, the supposed tech prodigy, was hiding in the shadows, begging for a secret rendezvous. The golden child was cracking. I locked the screen and stepped into my office, ready to face David and the spreadsheets, but the terror in my brother's text messages lingered, hinting that the carefully constructed facade of our parents' wealth was already beginning to splinter. Section 4. Bureaucratic Reality and Chekhov's Gun. Back in Sonoma. My reality was far removed from Palo Alto drama. Running a major clinical facility requires navigating immense bureaucracy. I was currently trapped in a brutal 14-month zoning dispute with the California Coastal Commission, fighting for environmental clearance to build a new inpatient wing. I spent my mornings analyzing soil density reports and managing a stalled $4 million construction loan. Into this chaos walked David, my forensic CPA. He was meticulously auditing the expansion's financials to satisfy the state board. David was thorough to a fault, known for finding discrepancies hidden deep in corporate filings. As I reviewed the architectural blueprints with him, my phone rang. It was Connor again, the Golden Boy, who was supposedly launching a revolutionary app in a prestigious San Jose tech incubator. Sounded physically ill. His voice cracked as he begged for a secret meeting. He insisted it was a matter of life and death, entirely separate from the graduation party disaster, and made me swear not to tell our parents. I viewed my family's chaos through the same lens I used for risk management, but the sheer terror in my brother's voice forced me to agree. The morning fog burned off early over the San Francisco skyline, revealing a harsh, bright sky above the Mission District. I chose an artisanal coffee roaster on Valencia Street for our meeting. The location was highly intentional. The cavernous room echoed with the sharp hiss of industrial espresso machines and the loud, overlapping conversations of local creatives. It was a space designed for public anonymity. Nobody pays attention to a tense conversation when they are staring at their own laptop screens. I sat at a small reclaimed wood table near the back, nursing a bitter black coffee. The long drive down from Sonoma had given me time to compartmentalize the lingering sting of the graduation party. I was operating in clinical crisis mode, evaluating the parameters of whatever disaster my brother had managed to create. The heavy glass door swung open, and I watched Connor walk inside. The physical deterioration of the Golden Boy was startling. Just 48 hours earlier, he had been standing by an infinity pool, radiating the curated perfection of a Stanford graduate. Now, he looked like a ghost haunting his own life. The tailored suit jacket was gone, replaced by an expensive but wrinkled hooded sweatshirt. The fabric hung loose off his shoulders, and dark patches of sweat stained the collar. His skin carried a sickly grayish pallor. His eyes darted around the crowded room with the frantic energy of a hunted animal. He spotted me in the corner and practically collapsed into the metal chair across the table. He did not go to the counter to order a drink. He just sat there, gripping the edge of the wood, staring at his trembling hands. He placed his cell phone face down next to my coffee cup. The irony of that gesture was profound. Connor believed placing the device face down secured his privacy. He remained oblivious to the digital leash our mother kept wrapped tightly around his neck. Evelyn suffered from a pervasive need to monitor the human assets she valued most. Years ago, she mandated that Connor install the location tracking application on his device, framing it as a standard safety measure. He never disabled the feature. Right at that very moment, sitting in her pristine living room miles down the peninsula, Evelyn was tracing a glowing dot that hovered directly over a coffee roaster in the Mission District. She was watching his location overlap with mine. Her trauma responses were already igniting, but Connor sat there unaware of the surveillance focusing only on the immediate threat to his survival. I waited in silence, letting the ambient noise of the cafe fill the space between us. In my practice, silence is a tool that forces the truth to the surface. Connor cracked under the quiet pressure. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and confessed. The revolutionary software application Richard had bragged about to the angel investors was a hollow shell. The startup was insolvent. Connor admitted his coding skills were rudimentary, at best capable of passing introductory university courses, but entirely insufficient to build a secure, scalable platform. He had outsourced the initial framework to overseas developers, but the underlying architecture was fundamentally broken. The primary investors were demanding a functional prototype by the end of the month. They were threatening to pull their seed funding and initiate a forensic audit of the development milestones. Connor was out of time and out of talent. His breathing grew ragged as he laid out the financial reality. The company accounts were overdrawn. He needed $45,000 by Friday to cover the developer payroll and keep the servers online. It was a desperate bridge loan intended to buy him a few more weeks of pretending the project was viable. He looked up from the table, his bloodshot eyes pleading with me. He asked me to write him the check. He knew I had the capital. He had overheard the professor mention the endowment on the lawn. But the true sting of his request was not the staggering amount of money. It was the condition he attached to the loan. Connor wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and asked me to maintain the dishwasher lie. He shamelessly insisted that I continue playing the role of the destitute failure around our parents. His logic was twisted but perfectly aligned with our toxic family dynamic. If Richard discovered that I possessed enough liquid wealth to drop $45,000 on a whim, Richard would instantly know that Connor had come to me for a bailout. The golden boy narrative would shatter. Connor expected me to silently fund his illusion while simultaneously wearing the disguise of a loser to protect his ego. The audacity of the request hung in the air, thicker than the scent of roasted coffee beans. I was expected to be the secret family bank while standing quietly in the corner as the designated punching bag. A deep, heavy exhaustion washed over me. It was the familiar weight of a dynamic I had carried since childhood. They broke things, and I quietly swept up the glass. I looked at my brother trembling in his designer clothes, trapped in a prison of expectations our father had built for him. I reached down into my leather tote bag resting on the floor. My fingers brushed past the thick files of environmental impact reports and found the smooth vinyl cover of my corporate checkbook. I pulled the heavy ledger out and placed it squarely on the reclaimed wood table. The transformation in Connor was instantaneous. The rigid tension holding his spine straight dissolved. His shoulders dropped and he exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The panic in his eyes was replaced by a wave of profound relief. He believed the old rules still applied. He assumed my lifelong habit of absorbing the family shame would force my hand. He thought the transaction was complete. The successful sister would pay the toll, the golden boy would survive another month, and the Palo Alto illusion would remain intact. I unclipped the silver pen from the binding of the ledger. I opened the cover to a fresh check. I did not look up at him. I kept my gaze focused on the crisp paper. I moved the pen across the top line, pressing the ink firmly into the page. I scribbled a sequence of numbers across the center where the monetary amount belonged. I capped the pen, set it aside, and gripped the top edge of the paper. I tore the check from the binding. The sharp ripping sound cut through the ambient noise of the cafe. I slid the slip of paper across the table until it rested right next to his phone. Connor reached for it, a grateful smile starting to form on his pale face. He looked down at the ink. The smile vanished. The paper did not bear a signature authorizing a transfer of $45,000. There was no financial bailout. The ink spelled out a 10-digit phone number belonging to the most ruthless commercial bankruptcy attorney in San Francisco. Connor stared at the 10 digits written in blue ink. His eyes darted from the paper to my face, searching for a punchline that was never going to arrive. The profound relief that had softened his posture mere seconds ago vanished, replaced by a suffocating panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just trembled. He looked back down at the slip of paper, tracing the numbers, as if deciphering a foreign language. The cafe around us continued its loud morning rhythm, with espresso grinders roaring and baristas calling out orders, but our table was trapped in a vacuum. This was not the transaction he had rehearsed. In his mind, he was dealing with the old version of his sister, the sibling who smoothed over every family crack and silently paid the tolls to keep the peace. He reached across the reclaimed wood and pushed the torn check back toward me. His fingers were shaking so badly, the paper fluttered against the grain of the table. He whispered that I did not understand the stakes. He said a bankruptcy lawyer could not fix this. He needed liquidity. He needed $45,000 by Friday, or his life was over. I picked up my tote bag and stood. I did not raise my voice inside the crowded roaster. I simply told him the conversation was over if he was going to continue lying to me. I turned and walked toward the exit, pushing through the heavy glass door into the damp San Francisco air. The morning fog had burned off, but the pavement remained slick with condensation. I walked toward the cramped alley parking lot adjacent to the cafe. My heels clicked against the damp asphalt. I could hear Connor rushing out the door behind me, his sneakers slapping the ground as he jogged to catch up. I reached my car and pulled my keys from my bag. Connor stepped between me and my car door. He held his hands up, palms facing outward, in a gesture of surrender. He begged me to just listen. He said I was the only person who could write the check without asking questions. That phrase struck a nerve deep within my chest. Without asking questions? It was the defining requirement of my existence in our family. Provide the resource, absorb the insult, and never ask questions. The dam broke. For a decade, I had honed my clinical composure. I sat across from patients navigating their deepest traumas with measured breathing and modulated tones. I prided myself on my ability to remain an objective anchor in a storm. But standing in that damp alley, I ceased to be a therapist. I was just the scapegoat daughter, and I was exhausted. I raised my voice. The volume shocked even me. I yelled at him. I demanded to know why I was expected to quietly finance the exact pedestal our parents used to degrade me. The words spilled out jagged and unpolished. I asked him how he could stand on that rented lawn in Palo Alto, wearing his graduation robes, listening to Evelyn call me a dishwasher and say nothing. I asked how he could watch Richard mock my ambition, knowing he planned to crawl into the city the very next day to beg for my money. I told him he was a coward. I pointed at his expensive hooded sweatshirt and told him his entire life was a subsidized illusion. I yelled that I had scrubbed grease traps and fought zoning boards to build an actual enterprise while he played the prodigy on our father's payroll. The raw, ugly emotion poured out, stripping away the polished veneer I worked so hard to maintain. I needed Connor to feel the weight of the hypocrisy. Connor did not retreat. He did not shrink away from my anger. Instead, the remaining color drained from his face, and a desperate manic energy took over. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. His voice cracked, dropping an octave into a harsh, gravelly tone. He told me to stop talking. He told me I had no idea what was actually happening inside the Palo Alto house. He snapped. The carefully constructed narrative of the Stanford genius launching a tech empire shattered on the wet pavement. The startup was not his dream. He never pitched the software. He did not know the first thing about managing an incubator. When he graduated, Richard sat him down in his mahogany home office and laid out a plan that was not a suggestion. Richard forced him to incorporate the company. Our father needed a clean, unblemished name to establish a limited liability corporation. Richard had leveraged his own commercial real estate portfolio to the breaking point. The properties were deeply underwater, suffocating under high-interest loans he could no longer service. Connor spoke rapidly, the words tumbling over each other as he confessed the scheme. Richard was secretly funneling venture capital through the tech startup. The seed money intended for software development was being diverted through shell accounts to prop up the failing real estate empire. Richard controlled the ledgers, manipulating the cash flow while keeping his own name entirely off the startup paperwork. I stood frozen against the door of my car. The magnitude of the financial crime washed over me. This was not a failing business. It was wire fraud. It was a calculated embezzlement scheme designed to deceive institutional investors. And the most horrifying aspect was the architect of the trap. Connor was merely the fall guy. He was the registered chief executive officer. His signature was on every fraudulent transfer. When the angel investors eventually audited the accounts and discovered the missing capital, Richard would be insulated. The federal authorities would look directly at Connor. The golden child was not a prodigy. He was a human shield. The silence that followed his confession was heavy. The delivery truck down the alley roared to life, but the sound felt miles away. I stared at my brother. The resentment I harbored for his privileged existence evaporated, replaced by a chilling realization. Richard and Evelyn had not nurtured a genius. They had bred a scapegoat of a different kind. I was the emotional punching bag, but Connor was the legal casualty. They were willing to sacrifice his freedom to protect their country club status. Before I could process the sheer scale of our father's betrayal, Connor reached forward. He grabbed my hand and shoved the torn check with the bankruptcy attorney number deep into my palm. He closed my fingers around the paper. He stepped back, his eyes wide with a hollow, haunted resignation. He whispered that I was right to keep my money away from him. He said the bridge loan would only delay the inevitable collapse. He turned around and walked briskly toward his own vehicle, parked a few spaces down the alley. He did not look back. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and put the car into gear. The tires chirped against the damp asphalt as he accelerated out of the lot, speeding off into the heavy city traffic. I remained rooted to the ground, alone in the morning chill. The slip of paper burned in my clenched fist. The entire foundation of my family was built on a criminal lie. I unlocked my car and sank into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut. The silence of the cabin offered no comfort. I needed to call my forensic accountant immediately. Needed to understand the exact mechanics of the shell company before the fallout dragged me into the blast radius. But as I reached for my phone, my screen lit up. The impending financial doom was only half the threat. While Connor was speeding away from the city, an entirely different kind of danger was already in motion. While I sat frozen in my car in the damp San Francisco alleyway, staring at the torn check in my palm, a very different kind of crisis was unfolding 30 miles south. My mother sat alone in the pristine living room of the Palo Alto estate. The morning sunlight filtered through custom plantation shutters, casting precise geometric shadows across the white wool rug. Evelyn held her silver tablet, resting it on her lap. The screen cast a cool blue glow against her face. She was staring at a digital map. For years, she had mandated that Connor share his geographic location through a tracking application. She framed the demand as a standard maternal safety precaution. In reality, it was a digital leash. Evelyn monitored her human investments with the same relentless scrutiny a day trader applies to a volatile stock portfolio. She zoomed in on the grid of the city streets. A glowing blue circle representing her son hovered directly over an artisanal coffee roaster in the Mission District. That alone was enough to raise her pulse. Connor was supposed to be in San Jose at the tech incubator pitching venture capitalists. But the true source of her escalating panic was the second blue circle pinging on the exact same coordinate. My location dot was overlapping with his. Evelyn did not see a brother and a sister grabbing coffee. She saw a catastrophic threat to her survival. To understand the sheer terror gripping my mother in that quiet living room, you have to understand the geography of her childhood. You have to understand Bakersfield. Long before she wore silk scarves and hosted catered graduation parties, Evelyn grew up in the crushing agricultural poverty of the Central Valley. Her earliest memories were defined by the suffocating summer heat, baking the San Joaquin soil into a fine dust that coated everything they owned. Her family survived by picking table grapes. She spent her formative years waking up before dawn, wrapping her hands in athletic tape to prevent the vines from slicing her fingers open and hauling heavy plastic bins down endless rows of crops. The harsh California sun bleached the color from their clothes and the optimism from their home. Poverty in that environment was not just a lack of funds. It was a physical weight pressing down on her chest every single day. It was the constant looming threat of the eviction notice taped to the front door of their cramped rental. It was the deep rural humiliation of standing in line at the local grocery store, watching her mother count out tarnished coins to pay for bread, while the cashier sighed in irritation. Evelyn learned very early that the world punishes the weak and ignores the poor. She clawed her way out of the dirt through sheer force of will, marrying Richard and adopting the polished facade of Silicon Valley elite. She reinvented herself entirely, erasing the girl from Bakersfield. To my mother, traditional markers of wealth were never mere status symbols. Stanford, degrees, luxury vehicles, and country club memberships functioned as structural barricades against starvation. They were tangible proof that she had outrun the dust. That underlying trauma dictated every parenting decision she ever made. When I chose to purchase property in Sonoma, I triggered her deepest psychological landmines. I moved to an agricultural county. I bought a dilapidated building surrounded by vineyards. I pursued a career in mental health therapy, a profession she viewed as soft and financially precarious compared to corporate law or software engineering. In her mind, I was not building a medical enterprise. I was orchestrating a horrifying regression back to the exact rural squalor she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. When I worked those late-night shifts, scrubbing the grease trap at the cafe, Evelyn did not see an entrepreneur putting in sweat equity. She saw her own mother scrubbing floors to survive. My existence terrified her. Connor represented the polar opposite. He was the golden ticket. He possessed the pristine academic pedigree and the promised tech chief executive title. He was the reinforced concrete wall standing between Evelyn and her traumatic past. His success validated her escape and justified the cold, demanding parenting style she utilized to mold him. Sitting on her expensive sofa, gripping the edges of her tablet, Evelyn watched our two digital markers pulse together on the map. Her breathing turned shallow. The traumatic conditioning of her childhood overrode any logical assessment of the situation. She did not assume we were reconciling after the disaster at the graduation party. She did not wonder if her son was reaching out to his sister for emotional support. Her mind immediately constructed a far more sinister narrative. She convinced herself that I was actively trying to sabotage the golden child. In her distorted reality, I was the bitter failed daughter poisoned by jealousy over his Stanford degree. She imagined me sitting in that coffee shop, whispering lies into his ear, attempting to drag him down into my presumed mediocrity. She believed I wanted him to abandon his tech career, so I would no longer be the sole disappointment of the family. The thought of Connor walking away from the incubator, the thought of losing the venture capital prestige, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. If Connor failed, the barricade would crumble. The country club associates would whisper. The creditors would circle. The dust of Bakersfield would finally catch up to her. She could practically taste the dry Central Valley dirt in the back of her throat. Evelyn set the tablet face down on the glass coffee table. Her hands were shaking, but her jaw was set with a grim, rigid determination. The embarrassment she felt when Dr. Thorne exposed the dishwasher lie the previous afternoon vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. She decided in that exact moment that I was a cancer threatening the host body of her family. A mother operating out of unresolved trauma does not fight fair. She fights to the death. She knew she could not simply yell at me or forbid Connor from seeing me. We were dealing with adults now, and mere scolding lacked permanence. She needed to deploy a tactic that would permanently neutralize my influence. She needed to discredit me so thoroughly that Connor would never trust a word I said about Richard or the startup. She had to attack the very foundation of my independence and sever my connection to her son. She stood up from the sofa and walked toward Richard's mahogany home office. Her bare feet made no sound against the hardwood floor. She closed the heavy double doors behind her, ensuring she was entirely alone in the room. She sat down at his leather executive chair and booted up his desktop computer. She did not know that Richard was funneling illicit funds through the startup. She did not know the enterprise was a criminal shell game designed to hide his massive commercial debts. She only knew she had to destroy my credibility to save her son from what she perceived as my toxic gravity. Evelyn opened a web browser and navigated to the official regulatory website for the state of California. Her eyes scanned the dense bureaucratic text, searching through the various consumer protection links. Finally, she found the specific portal she was looking for. It was the page designated for filing formal ethical grievances against licensed mental health professionals. She rested her fingers on the keyboard, taking a slow, steadying breath. She was ready to fabricate a narrative that would trigger an automatic state investigation. To protect her curated life, my mother was about to weaponize my own clinical license against me. Evelyn did not fire off a frantic text message. She did not call my phone to hurl insults or demand an explanation for my meeting with Connor. A mother driven by the raw terror of her own past does not waste energy on petty emotional squabbles. She aims for the jugular. Sitting at the mahogany desk in Palo Alto, she opened her laptop and initiated a calculated, devastating legal strike. She navigated to the state regulatory portal and typed out a formal grievance to the California Board of Behavioral Sciences. She did not hide behind an anonymous submission. She used her legal name, lending the fabricated allegations a dangerous veneer of credibility. The accusation was crafted with surgical precision. She typed that I was utilizing unethical psychological coercion and financial exploitation against a dependent family member. She spun a narrative where I was weaponizing my specialized clinical training to manipulate my younger brother, attempting to extort venture capital from his technology startup. She painted a picture of a predatory therapist preying on her own kin. She scanned her own uploaded documents, ensuring the complaint looked as official and damaging as possible. She pressed submit, sending the digital packet straight to the enforcement division. In the state of California, the regulatory board does not have the luxury of ignoring formal complaints filed by immediate relatives. The administrative statutes are designed to protect vulnerable patients from predatory practitioners. The system is built to assume the practitioner is a potential threat until proven otherwise. By invoking those specific legal buzzwords, Evelyn forced the government to act. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was triggering a mandatory state inquiry designed to strip me of my power. 3 days after my confrontation with Connor in the Mission District, the mail carrier walked into the sunlit reception area of my wellness retreat. I was standing near the front desk holding a stack of patient intake forms, discussing scheduling with my office manager. The carrier held a thick manila envelope requiring a signature. The return address bore the official seal of the Department of Consumer Affairs. I signed the electronic pad thanking the postal worker and walked back to my private office. The paper felt unusually heavy in my hands. I slid a brass letter opener through the top flap and pulled out the formal notice of investigation. My breath hitched as I read the charges printed on official state letterhead. The black ink blurred as my pulse hammered in my ears. This was not a minor family spat over holiday seating arrangements or hurtful comments at a graduation party. This was a direct, calculated threat against my entire identity and livelihood. Earning a clinical license in this state requires navigating a grueling, relentless gauntlet. After securing a demanding master's degree, I spent years logging 3,000 hours of supervised clinical work. I spent my 20s in windowless county facilities, counseling individuals through severe trauma addiction and crisis. I worked double shifts for barely more than minimum wage, sacrificing my personal life to meet the stringent state requirements. I sat for brutal licensing exams that tested every ounce of my academic and emotional endurance. That license hanging in a custom frame behind my desk was the undeniable proof of my independence. It was the foundation of the life I built from the dirt up. Without it, I was nothing. Evelyn was attempting to rip that foundation out from under me to protect a lie. The bureaucratic fallout of a state investigation is swift and ruthless. The regulatory board operates with mechanical efficiency. When a formal inquiry is launched, the state automatically flags the practitioner's public and commercial profiles. In the modern financial ecosystem, algorithms govern risk. Within 48 hours of opening that certified letter, my commercial bank detected the regulatory flag on my professional license. Risk management software does not care about nuanced family dynamics or fabricated allegations stemming from childhood poverty trauma. It only registers a potential liability that threatens the collateral. I received a cold, automated email from my commercial loan officer on a Thursday morning, followed by a terse phone call. The pending $4 million credit line required to break ground on my new inpatient wing was frozen pending the resolution of the state inquiry. The bank could not disperse funds to a medical director under active investigation for financial exploitation. The dominoes fell with terrifying speed, cascading through my business operations. I had to walk out the back doors of the clinic to the large dirt lot adjacent to the vineyards. 3 heavy excavators were already idling, ready to trench the foundation for the new wing. I had to signal the general contractor, a seasoned builder who had turned down other lucrative projects, to work on my retreat. I stood in the swirling dust, smelling the sharp tang of diesel fuel, and instructed him to halt the foundation pour immediately. The contractor crossed his arms, his weathered face tightening with frustration. He had a crew of 12 men expecting a full week's pay. I had to write a significant check from my operating reserves just to cover the demobilization costs, watching my hard-earned capital evaporate into the dry Sonoma air. The rumble of the heavy machinery died down, replaced by an eerie, hollow silence across the property. The expansion was dead in the water. The anxiety quickly bled into the clinic walls, permeating the calm environment I had fought so hard to cultivate. My team of 20 licensed clinicians relied on me for their livelihood. They chose to work at this retreat because of the stability, the ethical standards, and the clear vision I provided. Now they were noticing the halted construction equipment, sitting idle in the dirt. They saw the sudden influx of dense legal documents printing in my office. The whispered conversations started in the staff break room. They could sense the sudden instability threatening our collective future. My lead trauma specialist knocked on my door later that afternoon, her eyes filled with concern. She asked if the rumors about the bank freeze were true. I offered a practiced, reassuring smile, deflecting the question with corporate jargon about temporary municipal holds. Lying to my own team felt like a betrayal of the core values I built the clinic upon, but I could not burden them with my family chaos. I had to maintain a calm, professional exterior while my stomach churned with nausea. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. I was counseling patients on managing their anxiety while my own heart raced constantly. Evelyn had not just insulted my career choices at a garden party. She had effectively paralyzed my entire medical enterprise. She cut off the financial oxygen to my business, hoping I would suffocate panic and crawl back into the obedient, subservient role she demanded. She was willing to destroy the jobs of my employees, delay the care of vulnerable patients, and shatter my hard-earned reputation just to maintain her illusion of control over Connor. She burned my sanctuary to keep her own narrative warm. Has a family member ever gone beyond insults and actively tried to destroy your livelihood to protect their own narrative? Share how you survived it below, because navigating that level of betrayal requires a specific kind of endurance. I sat in my quiet office staring at the frozen construction site through the large glass window. The setting sun cast long shadows over the idle excavators. I could not simply drive down to Palo Alto and demand an apology. An emotional confrontation would only provide Evelyn with more ammunition to prove my supposed instability to the state investigators. The California Board of Behavioral Sciences required sworn affidavits, forensic financial disclosures, and an ironclad legal defense. I needed to hire a specialized administrative attorney to fight the board while David scoured the corporate ledgers Connor had inadvertently exposed. The battle was shifting from personal grievances to brutal procedural warfare, and the stakes had escalated beyond anything I ever anticipated. The next 90 days transformed my life into a grueling administrative nightmare. You cannot fix a state regulatory investigation with a passionate monologue or a tearful apology. The government demands data, and they demand it formatted to their exact specifications. I retained a specialized defense attorney who charged $450 an hour just to read my emails. He was a former state prosecutor, a man devoid of bedside manner, but intimately familiar with the bureaucratic labyrinth of Sacramento. He handed me a binder 3 inches thick and told me to substantiate every interaction I had with my family for the past 5 years. He required text message transcripts, bank statements, and geolocation records to prove I never exerted undue influence over my brother. My evenings ceased to be mine. Once the clinic doors locked and the final patient departed, I retreated to my office and pulled the blinds, shutting out the world. I spent countless midnight hours compiling thousands of pages of client logs and financial records. Every document required meticulous redaction to comply with federal patient privacy laws. I had to reach out to former supervisors and colleagues, asking them to sign sworn affidavits attesting to my ethical character. The sheer humiliation of requesting those character references burned my throat. The sustained stress began to hollow me out physically. I lost 12 pounds in the first month. My sleep cycle shattered. I would lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, counting the blades, while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. During the daylight hours, I maintained the polished, serene exterior my patients expected. I modulated my voice and offered grounding techniques while my own hands shook under my desk. The cognitive dissonance of healing others while being actively dismantled by my own mother was a unique kind of torture. The mounting legal fees were draining my operating reserves, but the frozen commercial credit line remained the most pressing operational threat. I needed to unfreeze the $4 million to resume construction on the inpatient wing. I scheduled a late evening meeting with David, my forensic accountant, hoping to find a temporary financial workaround. David sat across the oak conference table, reviewing the harsh denial letters from the bank. I opened my leather tote bag to retrieve my personal bank statements. As I pulled the folder free, a crumpled stack of paper tumbled onto the polished wood. It was the corporate ledger printouts Connor had shoved into my palm, along with the torn check during our confrontation in the Mission District. In the chaos of the state investigation, I had forgotten they were even in my bag. I reached across the table to throw the useless papers in the recycling bin, but David stopped my hand. His eyes caught a routing number printed near the top margin of the crumpled page. The forensic instinct in him ignited. He asked permission to examine the papers. I nodded, pouring myself a cup of black coffee, while he flattened the creased documents. David began typing sequences into his secure terminal cross-referencing public property records and corporate registry filings. The silence in the office stretched for 20 minutes, broken only by the rapid clicking of his keyboard. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from analytical curiosity to grim realization. He turned his monitor toward me and pointed to a highlighted column of transfers. My brother was listed as the chief executive of the startup, but the initial seed capital did not originate from prestigious Silicon Valley venture firms. David traced the incoming wire transfers back to a highly leveraged home equity line of credit. Richard had borrowed against the Palo Alto estate. It was a toxic variable rate loan secured at the peak of the housing market, before property values began to soften. My father had extracted every ounce of equity from the mansion to fund a hollow tech company using his son's clean name to bypass the strict commercial lending limits he had already exhausted. Richard was siphoning that borrowed residential money through the startup ledger right back into his failing commercial real estate portfolio to pay off angry creditors. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and the transaction fees alone were bleeding him dry. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The lavish graduation party, the expensive tailored suits, the arrogant jokes about washing dishes were all funded by predatory debt. The wealth my parents weaponized to humiliate me did not actually exist. While I was sitting in my office, painstakingly proving my innocence through legitimate legal channels, Richard was frantically dialing hard money lenders in back rooms, trying to secure usurious loans to cover the monthly interest payments on a house he no longer truly owned. The contrast between our two realities was stark and undeniable. My crisis was temporary. The state board required a grueling procedural defense, but I possessed the pristine documentation to win. My foundation was built on solid ethical labor. Richard's foundation was built entirely on fraud and borrowing. He was orchestrating a shell game that required constant fresh capital to prevent a collapse. By failing to secure the bridge loan from me, Connor had missed a critical payroll cycle. The offshore developers were preparing to drop the servers. The entire illusion was unraveling at breakneck speed. Richard remained oblivious that his financial crimes were sitting on a desk in Sonoma, decoded by the very daughter he deemed a failure. Evelyn thought she had engineered a masterstroke by attacking my clinical license. In reality, she had merely distracted me while the ground beneath her own feet turned to dust. The board hearing was scheduled for the end of the month. My lawyer assured me we had built an ironclad defense. I just needed to endure the final weeks of the investigation without making contact with my family. I gathered the corporate paperwork and locked it in my filing cabinet. The truth about the Palo Alto estate was a ticking clock, but I decided to let time do the heavy lifting. I did not need to expose my father to the authorities, because the mathematics of his deception were already coming for him. The debt was inescapable. However, the pressure of that inescapable debt was not falling on Richard. It was falling squarely on the fragile shoulders of the young man whose name adorned all the fraudulent documents. While I locked the doors of my clinic and drove home through the quiet vineyards, the crushing weight of the scheme was finally breaking the golden child. The storm was no longer gathering. It was making landfall on the Pacific Coast Highway. The weight of our father's financial deception did not crush the architect of the scheme. It fractured the fragile foundation of the son forced to carry the secret. While I sat in my Sonoma office, battling the bureaucratic freeze, Connor was breaking apart on the Pacific Coast Highway. Early on a Tuesday morning, he left his San Jose apartment, aiming his car south towards Santa Cruz. He had no destination in mind. He only knew he had to escape the ringing phones and the threatening emails from angel investors demanding a forensic audit. The California coastline is notoriously unforgiving. A thick morning marine layer rolled in off the ocean, swallowing the asphalt and dropping visibility to near zero. The dense coastal fog matched the suffocating dread tightening in his chest. Connor was driving blind in every sense of the word. The venture capitalists had issued a final deadline. He knew the offshore developers had abandoned the servers. The realization that he was facing federal wire fraud charges while his parents slept soundly in their Palo Alto estate triggered a crippling wave of panic. His lungs seized, his vision tunneled, attempting to navigate the treacherous winding curves near Half Moon Bay while hyperventilating proved impossible. He overcorrected the steering wheel, entering a sharp bend. The tires lost traction on the damp pavement. The sedan skidded across the centerline and slammed into the steel guardrail separating the highway from the sheer cliff drop. The impact tore the passenger side metal to shreds. The airbags deployed with an explosive burst of white powder and deafening force. The windshield shattered into a spiderweb of opaque glass. The vehicle ground to a halting screech against the barrier, mere inches from a fatal plunge into the rocky surf below. Bruised, battered, and psychologically shattered, Connor pushed his way out of the smoking wreckage. He stumbled onto the foggy shoulder of the highway. The cold, ocean wind whipped through his torn clothes. He stood on the edge of the cliff, staring down at the churning gray water. He did not call Richard. He did not dial Evelyn. When staring into the abyss, a person instinctively reaches for the only anchor they trust to hold firm. My personal cell phone rang at 7 a.m. I was standing in my kitchen pouring a cup of coffee, preparing for another grueling day of legal defense strategy. I saw his name illuminate the screen. The lingering anger over the regulatory complaint and the venture capital lies dissolved the instant I answered the call. I did not hear a greeting. I heard the harsh, jagged sound of a man struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs, mingled with the roar of the ocean wind and the rhythmic ticking of a hazard light. Connor sobbed into the receiver. The polished Stanford graduate was gone. In his place was a terrified boy confessing that his car was destroyed and his life was over. He admitted the venture capitalists were initiating legal action today. He confessed the depth of his despair, stating he could see no way out of the trap our father had engineered. Then, he spoke the words that trigger alarms in every clinical professional. He articulated a specific, active suicidal ideation. He told me the drop from the guardrail looked peaceful. He said jumping would solve the legal problems and erase the shame he was about to bring upon the family name. The air in my kitchen grew heavy. The feud over the clinic expansion, the anger regarding the frozen bank accounts, the bitterness of the garden party vanished. None of those grievances mattered against the raw, terrifying threat to human life. I dropped my role as the wounded sister and stepped instantly into the discipline of a licensed clinical director. I stabilized my own breathing, slowing my heart rate to project clear, calm authority through the cellular connection. I lowered the pitch of my voice, utilizing a measured grounding cadence. I did not argue with his despair or offer empty platitudes about a bright future. A mind locked in an acute crisis cannot process complex logic or forced optimism. It requires an immediate tether to the physical present. I asked him to describe the texture of the guardrail under his hand. I demanded he name 3 things he could see through the fog and 2 things he could hear besides the ocean. I forced his brain to redirect processing power from the escalating panic cycle to basic sensory input. He stammered, describing the cold, wet steel, the smell of the airbag propellant, and the gray pavement. I matched my breathing to his, instructing him to inhale for 4 seconds, hold, and exhale for 6. I kept my voice firm and unwavering, commanding his attention, refusing to let his focus drift back toward the cliff edge. While keeping him anchored on my cell phone, I moved to my home office and picked up the landline. I bypassed the local emergency numbers and directly contacted the California Highway Patrol Dispatch Center for San Mateo County. I identified myself as a licensed mental health professional, reporting an active psychiatric emergency resulting from a motor vehicle collision. I relayed his exact geographic coordinates based on the mile markers he provided through his tiers. I instructed the dispatcher to send units without utilizing their sirens to avoid triggering a startle response that might push him over the edge. I stayed on the line with Connor for 26 minutes. I walked out of my house, climbed into my Subaru, and initiated the drive south toward the coast, keeping the phone pressed to the dashboard speaker. I narrated my journey to him, offering a constant stream of vocal reassurance. I promised him that fraud charges could be fought. I assured him that bankruptcy was a legal tool, not a death sentence. I told him our parents' ego was not worth the price of his heartbeat. I kept talking until I heard the crunch of heavy boots on gravel and the calm, authoritative voice of a highway patrol officer asking him to step away from the ledge. Only when the officer confirmed he had secured the scene did I end the call. I drove down the 101 freeway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my forearms ached. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a cold, hollow realization in its wake. Richard and Evelyn spent their entire lives shielding Connor from accountability, cultivating a fragile perfection that shattered at the first sign of genuine adversity. They prioritized the preservation of their country club image over the psychological resilience of their own son. Their relentless pursuit of prestige had nearly cost him his life. I arrived at the Coastal Medical Center an hour later. The emergency room was a sterile, chaotic environment, but I navigated the triage desk with the authority of a medical provider. I found Connor sitting on a rigid hospital bed in a small curtained cubicle. He was wrapped in a heated blanket, shivering despite the warmth. A jagged purple bruise marred his left cheekbone, where the airbag had struck him. His designer clothing was torn and stained with blood from minor glass abrasions. He looked incredibly small. He looked up when I pushed the curtain aside. Fresh tears pooled in his eyes. He apologized repeatedly, his voice a fragile whisper. I walked over and sat on the edge of the narrow mattress. I did not ask about the venture capitalists or the fraudulent ledgers. I simply placed my hand over his trembling fingers and told him he was safe. In that sterile room, smelling of iodine and cheap institutional coffee, the dynamic of our entire sibling relationship shifted permanently. The era of sibling rivalry engineered by our parents dissolved. He was no longer the golden child, and I was no longer the destitute dishwasher. We were just two survivors standing in the wreckage of a toxic legacy. I had proven my professional competence not by securing a high-profile university grant or navigating a corporate boardroom, but by talking my brother down from the edge of a coastal highway. I prioritized his life over our parents' relentless war. The attending physician entered the cubicle, confirming Connor was physically stable, but required a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric observation hold due to the nature of the emergency call. I handled the admission paperwork, utilizing my clinical credentials to ensure he received a private room and a specialized trauma evaluation. As I signed the final release forms, my focus hardened into a cold, precise determination. The state administrative hearing regarding my license was scheduled for the following week. Evelyn was preparing to take the stand to destroy my career while remaining entirely oblivious that her own actions had nearly driven her son into the Pacific Ocean. She believed she held all the cards. She had no idea the game had fundamentally changed. The administrative hearing room in Sacramento was a study in sterile professional indifference. The fluorescent lighting overhead hummed with an aggressive flat frequency that seemed to vibrate against the white walls. It was the kind of space designed to extract facts and discard emotion. I sat at a narrow table with my legal counsel arranging my documents. The atmosphere felt stifling. My attorney, a man who viewed human interactions strictly through the prism of state code, kept his eyes fixed on the judge. Across the aisle sat Evelyn, She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. She was wearing a beige dress that felt entirely appropriate for the drab surroundings. She had arrived without Richard. My father had opted to stay behind in Palo Alto, likely terrified that his own financial house of cards would crumble under the intense scrutiny of a state tribunal. The administrative law judge entered the room, shuffling a stack of thick legal filings. She had the weary face of a public servant who had heard 10,000 family disputes and found no surprises in any of them. Evelyn was sworn in by the court reporter. Her hand trembled as she placed it on the Bible. When the questioning began, she did not launch into a villainous monologue. She did not raise her voice to accuse me of being a calculated monster. Instead, she wept. She leaned into the microphone, her voice cracking with a fragile resonance that sounded painfully sincere. She painted a picture of me as a jealous failure. She claimed I was a bitter daughter who felt neglected by her upbringing and was now using my clinical credentials to sabotage the only member of the family who had actually achieved greatness. The dramatic irony filling the room was both palpable and profoundly satisfying to witness from the defense side of the aisle. The judge, the state investigators, and my legal team were all literal observers of Exhibit A, which sat neatly labeled on the bench before them. It contained the complete audited financials of my Sonoma wellness retreat. The pages clearly displayed the $4 million valuation and the verified multi-million-dollar revenue stream. Beside it sat the official documentation from Stanford, confirming my clinical institute had endowed their department. The evidence screamed of a level of success that rendered Evelyn's narrative of a destitute failure entirely absurd. As she cried about trying to save Connor from ending up with nothing, her deep-rooted Bakersfield trauma began to bleed through her testimony. She rambled about the insecurity of her youth, the fear of debt, and the absolute necessity of clinging to status at all costs. The judge listened with a patient, impassive expression. She watched the woman on the stand, not as a credible witness reporting an ethical crime, but as a deeply terrified, projecting parent. Evelyn was not speaking about my supposed professional negligence. She was speaking about her own ghosts. She was describing the crushing poverty that had shaped her, and the desperate need to keep the golden boy shielded from the reality of failure. Her testimony inadvertently shredded her own credibility. She provided the judge with the exact blueprint of her bias. She admitted under oath that she had never actually observed me working with patients. She confessed she had never toured my facility or reviewed my business practices. Every accusation she leveled was based on the assumption that my rejection of the Palo Alto tech trajectory necessitated my professional ruin. She was essentially arguing that because I refused to play by her specific set of financial rules, I must be ethically compromised. The investigator for the state board took notes with a bored expression. He had seen hundreds of these retaliatory grievances. When my turn came to sit in the witness chair, I did not deliver an emotional rebuttal. I answered the questions directly and concisely. I offered the judge the patient progress charts and the state-mandated safety protocols I maintained at the retreat. I spoke about the clinical methodology we utilized for trauma-informed care. I did not mention the graduation party. I did not mention the dishwasher label. I did not bring up the broken checkbook. I kept the entire testimony focused strictly on the professional standards of behavior I adhered to daily. The judge looked over her spectacles at my mother. She asked Evelyn to cite one specific instance of unethical manipulation. Evelyn stammered, searching for a concrete example, and eventually defaulted to the secret coffee meeting I had with Connor. She insisted that meeting was proof I was trying to poison his mind. My attorney stood up and presented the phone records showing that Connor had initiated every single contact. He showed the text messages documenting the brotherly plea for help after the car accident. The judge reviewed the evidence, and her face remained unreadable. Evelyn seemed to realize she had lost the room, but she could not stop. She pushed harder, trying to regain control of the narrative. She leaned toward the judge and demanded that the state board strip me of my credentials. She said it was the only way to ensure the safety of the family. The judge sighed a soft, tired sound and signaled for a break. As Evelyn stepped down from the stand, she caught my eye for a fleeting second. For the first time, I did not see hatred in her expression. I saw raw, pathetic confusion. She genuinely could not comprehend how I had survived her attempt to dismantle my life. She expected me to be the broken failure she had been describing. Seeing me composed and prepared clearly rattled the foundation of her belief system. I remained in the chair while the state investigators huddled in the hallway. My attorney leaned in close and whispered that the board would likely dismiss the case before lunch. The investigator walked back into the room and addressed the judge. He stated that the state found absolutely no evidence of clinical misconduct or financial exploitation. He recommended the immediate closure of the investigation. The judge did not even bother to retreat to her chambers. She looked at Evelyn, who was still sitting in the front row, wiping her eyes. The hearing was over. The state of California had officially cleared my name. I felt no surge of triumph. I only felt a heavy, hollow clarity. I had survived the primary legal threat, but I knew Evelyn would not go home and accept defeat. She had sacrificed her last shred of dignity in that room to keep me labeled as the family disappointment. She was not a woman who knew how to retreat. While the court clerk began gathering the files, I checked my phone. Another alert had appeared. It was David, the accountant. He had discovered a massive wire transfer anomaly originating from the startup account that had just been flagged by the primary bank. The corporate shell game was entering a phase of total collapse. I stood up from the walnut table, smoothed my jacket, and looked at the clock on the wall. The hearing took longer than anticipated. I was already late for my afternoon session at the clinic. I walked out of the Sacramento office building into the blistering midday heat, feeling the weight of the investigation lift. But as I reached my car, I saw my father waiting by the entrance. He had been lurking outside the entire time. He did not look like the corporate mogul who gave speeches at the Plaza Hotel. He looked old and gray and absolutely terrified. He did not ask how the hearing went. He simply asked if I knew where Connor had gone after his mandatory psychiatric observation hold ended. My stomach turned. I realized then that my brother had not just walked out of the hospital. He had disappeared entirely and taken the keys to the digital fortress with him. Richard, standing outside the state building, was a desperate man waiting for a ghost. A gray rideshare sedan pulled up to the concrete curb. The rear door opened and Connor stepped onto the pavement. My father lunged forward, grabbing my brother's sleeve and hissing frantic instructions to get back inside the vehicle. He offered to call a private doctor to make the problems disappear. Connor simply reached over, peeled our father's fingers off his jacket, and continued walking. The golden child had spent his life molding himself to fit our parents' expectations, but the car crash had shattered that blind obedience. I watched Connor push through the revolving glass doors, heading straight for the security checkpoint. The hearing was in a temporary recess before the judge entered her final ruling on the docket. I followed my brother back into the sterile corridors. We re-entered the hearing room just as the clerk called the session back to order. Evelyn sat at the complainant's table, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the aggrieved mother. She was entirely oblivious that the weapon she had forged was about to turn against her. The administrative law judge took her seat, adjusting her microphone, preparing to formalize the investigator's recommendation to close the inquiry. Before the judge could speak a word, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open. Connor walked straight down the center aisle. Richard slipped in behind him, lingering in the shadows of the gallery, whispering furious, hushed protests, attempting to command his son to sit down. Connor ignored the frantic commands from the back row. He approached the wooden bench, looked directly at the judge, and stated his name for the public record. He requested permission to offer sworn testimony regarding the allegations filed against my license. The judge paused, studying the young man standing before her. Connor did not resemble the polished Silicon Valley tech prodigy Evelyn had described during her tearful testimony. He wore the same wrinkled, hooded sweatshirt he had worn in the hospital observation ward, and a dark purple bruise marred his cheekbone. Sensing the gravity of his demeanor, the judge allowed the clerk to swear him in. Connor took the witness stand. He carried a thick manila folder, resting it squarely on his lap. He opened the cover and handed a stack of documents to the bailiff, requesting they be entered into evidence. The papers were his official psychiatric discharge records and recent medical evaluations from the Coastal Hospital. He spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity that echoed through the silent room. He turned his head, looked directly at Evelyn, and stated under oath that I had never manipulated him. He testified that his mother had fabricated the entire narrative of psychological coercion to serve her own agenda. He told the judge that my strict refusal to lend him money during our meeting in the Mission District was the only honest grounding interaction he had experienced in a year. He explained that Evelyn filed the grievance out of a misplaced desire to punish me for enforcing a healthy financial boundary. Evelyn gripped the edge of her table, the residual color draining from her face. She tried to interrupt the testimony, but the judge raised a hand, silencing her instantly. Connor was not finished speaking. He reached back into his folder and pulled out a second stack of paper. This stack contained the corporate financial ledgers of the San Jose technology startup. While Richard turned a sickly shade of gray in the back row, Connor publicly admitted the catastrophic failure of the incubator project. He did not hide behind excuses regarding his lack of coding skills. He laid his own shortcomings bare on the stand. Then he detailed the exact mechanics of the financial fraud his father had orchestrated behind the scenes. He explained how Richard used the limited liability company as a corporate shell. He testified that the seed capital intended for software development was being systematically funneled to prop up underwater commercial real estate loans tied to our father's holding company. Connor explained that he was set up as the registered chief executive officer, rendering him legally liable for the fraudulent transfers. He exposed the entire shell game on the public record in front of the state investigators. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from administrative routine to stunned silence. Connor looked at the gallery where our father stood, paralyzed by the sudden exposure of his crimes. Before stepping down from the witness chair, Connor stated clearly that he was legally emancipating himself from Richard's financial control. He announced he was severing all ties to the toxic venture capital that had driven him to the edge of a coastal cliff. He stood up, leaving the stack of damning financial ledgers on the witness stand, and walked out of the room without looking at either of our parents. The administrative judge reviewed the new evidence, running her fingers over the bank routing numbers and the psychiatric discharge summaries. She looked at Evelyn, who was staring blankly at the empty witness chair, unable to process the betrayal. She looked at the gallery, but Richard had already slipped out the back doors, fleeing the building to avoid answering any questions. The judge picked up her wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. She declared the grievance against me dismissed with prejudice, ensuring the complaint could never be refiled or weaponized again. She ordered the state investigator to formally clear my professional record. The bureaucratic machine that had paralyzed my life reversed course with shocking speed. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, my defense attorney expedited the clearance paperwork. The regulatory flag vanished from my commercial profile, erasing the stigma Evelyn had tried to attach to my name. I forwarded the certified dismissal order directly to my loan officer. My commercial bank lifted the freeze on my business operations before the close of business. I stood in the parking lot dialing my general contractor. I authorized him to bring the heavy excavators back to the Sonoma dirt lot and resume the foundation pour for the new inpatient wing. The battle for my license was over, and my enterprise was secure. The relief washing over me was profound, but it was tempered by a chilling realization of what was to come. Connor had saved my career, but his sworn testimony had just introduced Richard's financial crimes into a public state record. The venture capitalists were going to discover the diverted funds as soon as they initiated their audit. The fragile house of cards propping up the Palo Alto estate was primed for a catastrophic collapse. The storm I had weathered was merely a localized front. A much larger financial hurricane was forming over my parents' heavily leveraged mansion, and this time they had no golden child left to absorb the impact. Connor stepping down from the witness stand did not merely conclude a state regulatory grievance. His sworn testimony ignited a financial powder keg that decimated my father's curated reality. In the hyper-connected ecosystem of Silicon Valley tech investments, secrets possess an incredibly short shelf life. The administrative tribunal entered the transcript of the hearing into the public record of California. Within 48 hours, a junior partner doing routine due diligence at the primary venture capital firm uncovered the sworn statements. The angel investors who had poured seed capital into the San Jose incubator, expecting disruptive software, read the exact granular details of the diverted funds. They discovered their millions were never utilized to hire developers or secure server space. Instead, the cash had been systematically funneled through a maze of corporate shell accounts to prop up Richard's failing commercial properties. The reaction from the investors was swift and merciless. They did not request a polite meeting or seek an explanation. They deployed a specialized litigation team to file emergency injunctions, freezing every asset tied to the startup. They formally withdrew their backing and initiated a rigorous forensic audit of the development milestones. The paper trail my accountant David had mapped out in my quiet Sonoma office transformed into a glaring, undeniable reality, facing institutional scrutiny. Richard had spent decades constructing his empire on a precarious architecture of leverage, operating under the arrogant assumption that he could consistently outpace his debts by securing fresh rounds of funding. But the Bay Area commercial real estate sector was experiencing a severe, punishing downturn. The shift toward remote work left corporate office buildings vacant, and property valuations across the peninsula plunged. To maintain his image and service his underwater mortgages, Richard had turned to his last available resource. He had extracted millions through a high-risk home equity line of credit, leveraged directly against the Palo Alto estate. Banks issuing such substantial loans monitor the financial health of their borrowers with ruthless algorithms. When the venture capital firm filed their public injunctions citing wire fraud and corporate malfeasance, the commercial bank holding the home equity debt caught the digital flag. The risk management software identified a catastrophic default hazard. The collateral securing the loan was fundamentally compromised by the impending litigation. Financial institutions embed specific acceleration clauses deep within their lending contracts to protect their capital from fraudulent borrowers. The bank invoked their right to demand immediate repayment of the entire outstanding balance. Richard received the certified demand letter on a Tuesday morning. The man who had confidently sneered at my ambition and joked about me scrubbing plates now found himself trapped in a mathematical vice. He lacked the liquid assets to satisfy the staggering demand. His commercial properties were deeply in the red, generating insufficient revenue to cover even their basic operating expenses. Panic drove my father to abandon his polished demeanor. He spent his days driving down Sand Hill Road and making frantic phone calls from the parking lot of the Rosewood Hotel, trying to secure unregulated bridge loans to cover the deficit. He reached out to the wealthy associates who had attended the graduation party. But the Whisper network in affluent neighborhoods operates with brutal efficiency. The country club acquaintances, sensing the impending ruin, stopped answering his calls. The invitations to local charity galas ceased arriving. The prestigious veneer that Richard and Evelyn had weaponized to humiliate me for a decade dissolved into thin air, exposing the brittle, hollow reality beneath. Their entire identity had been funded by predatory debt. Every catered event, every luxury vehicle lease, every silk scarf, and imported bottle of wine was purchased with borrowed money they could never repay. Evelyn found herself trapped inside the sprawling house, watching the illusion fracture. She stared at the expensive modern art on the walls and the custom imported furniture, realizing it all belonged to the bank. The Stanford degree she had forced upon Connor, the tech founder status she had worshipped as her ultimate achievement, was the very instrument that brought the ruin directly to her doorstep. The deep-rooted trauma of her Bakersfield youth resurfaced with a vengeance. The barrier she had built to separate herself from her rural poverty had collapsed. She could no longer project the image of the untouchable, wealthy matriarch. The raw terror of eviction, the memory of counting tarnished coins for bread, crept back into her daily existence. The fear she had tried to project onto me had finally found its true permanent home in her own living room. She paced the hardwood floors, listening to her husband argue with loan officers, knowing the battle was already lost. Have you ever watched someone who spent years belittling your honest labor lose their curated empire to their own arrogance? Let me know how that justice felt in the comments below, because witnessing the scales balance requires a profound level of endurance. 2 weeks after the administrative judge cleared my clinical license, the final blow arrived. It was a crisp, sunny morning in Palo Alto. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the sound of landscapers trimming hedges and residents walking their purebred dogs. A plain white sedan pulled into the circular stamped concrete driveway of my parents' property. A man wearing a windbreaker and carrying a thick clipboard walked purposefully up the path. He did not ring the doorbell. He did not wait for the housekeeper to answer. He produced a roll of heavy-duty tape from his pocket and affixed a formal notice of default directly onto the custom mahogany front door. The legal document was printed on bright neon paper, unmistakable and highly visible from the street for all the passing neighbors to see. The bank had officially initiated the foreclosure process. Richard stood inside his grand foyer, staring through the sidelight windows at the paper sealing his fate. The patriarch who had prioritized prestige over his own son's survival was now facing the total foreclosure of his identity. He had spent his entire adult life building a monument to his own superiority only to watch it crumble under the weight of his deception. The walls of the estate provided no shelter from the financial storm he created. His empire was reduced to a public notice of failure, fluttering in the coastal breeze. The illusion was dead, leaving my parents with nowhere to turn, setting the stage for a desperate final maneuver that would bring them right to my doorstep. The neon paper taped to the mahogany door in Palo Alto left Richard and Evelyn with no remaining avenues of escape. Their country club peers had abandoned them. The hard money lenders refused to return their calls. The venture capital attorneys were preparing to depose Richard regarding the wire fraud. With their curated reality fracturing around them, my parents climbed into their leased sedan and drove north on the 101 freeway. They crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and headed toward the agricultural heart of Sonoma County. For the first time in 6 years, they were coming to see the daughter they had actively tried to ruin. I was standing near the front reception desk of my wellness retreat when they arrived. The afternoon sunlight poured through the glass doors, illuminating the serene lobby. I watched my parents pull into the gravel parking lot. The visual contrast was jarring. They were no longer the arrogant monarchs holding court at a Stanford garden party. Richard moved with a slow, heavy shuffle, his shoulders stooped under the weight of his impending financial ruin. Evelyn clutched her handbag tight against her chest, her gaze darting nervously around the manicured meditation gardens. They looked like strangers lost in a foreign landscape. My lead assistant greeted them with professional warmth. She did not know they were the architects of the recent regulatory investigation that had briefly paralyzed our operations. She simply saw 2 elderly individuals, appearing deeply distressed. I instructed my assistant to usher them directly into my executive boardroom. I needed to control the environment. I needed this confrontation to occur in a space where the power dynamics were undeniable and firmly established in my favor. I gave them 3 minutes to settle before entering the room. I walked through the double doors and took my seat at the head of the long, live-edge oak table. Richard and Evelyn sat across from me, huddled close together. The boardroom was an expansive, airy space, featuring large windows overlooking the rolling vineyards. But I had intentionally designed the interior decor to serve as a quiet testament to my journey. Hanging directly on the wall behind where my parents sat was a custom shadow box encased in museum-quality glass. Inside the frame rested the canvas apron I wore during those grueling 2 a.m. shifts at the roadside cafe. The fabric was permanently stained with dark patches of rancid fry oil and bleached at the hem. It was the exact garment I had been wearing 6 years ago when they walked into my diner, stayed for 12 minutes, and left in disgust. I had preserved it as a reminder of the relentless labor required to build my enterprise. Now the 2 people who had mocked my ambition and called me a dishwasher were forced to sit directly beneath the very symbol of the era they had ridiculed. The visual poetry of the moment was stark. They had come to beg for their survival under the shadow of the grit they had despised. Evelyn did not attempt to maintain her usual haughty demeanor. The cold, calculating woman who had filed a fabricated ethical grievance against my license was gone. The raw terror of her Bakersfield youth had fully consumed her. She looked at me and broke down. She wept with a loud, jagged intensity that echoed off the boardroom walls. She stripped away every layer of her Palo Alto facade, pleading for salvation. She explained that the bank had initiated the foreclosure process. The notice of default was public. They were weeks away from being physically locked out of the estate. She begged me for a cash injection of $150,000. She stated the exact figure, with a trembling voice explaining it was the precise amount required to cure the immediate mortgage default and halt the foreclosure proceedings. She promised they would sell the house and pay me back once the market stabilized. She offered hollow guarantees, trying to sound rational, but her sobbing betrayed her deep panic. She pleaded that they would have nowhere to go, leaning into the maternal bond she had historically weaponized against me. Richard did not speak. The man who had proudly announced he had given up on me at the graduation party could not even muster the courage to look at me. He stared intensely at the grain of the oak table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The shame of sitting in his daughter's successful clinic, asking for a bailout to cover his fraudulent debts, had stripped him of his voice. He looked hollowed out, reduced to a silent bystander in his own demise. He was waiting for his wife to secure the lifeline he was too proud to request himself. I sat at the head of the table, listening to the frantic cadence of my mother's pleas. As a clinical director, I am trained to maintain objectivity in the presence of severe emotional distress. But I am also a daughter. Sitting across from the two people who raised me, watching them crumble under the weight of their own arrogance, triggered a profound, messy internal conflict. The professional armor I wore every day began to crack, exposing the deeply vulnerable parts of my psyche I thought I had healed years ago. The wounded child inside me screamed to open the drawer and pull out my corporate checkbook. A persistent toxic logic echoed in the back of my mind. It whispered that if I wrote the check, I would finally prove my ultimate worth to them. It suggested that rescuing them from the brink of homelessness would force them to acknowledge my success and grant me the parental validation they had withheld my entire life. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I believed that saving the Palo Alto estate would magically transform them into the loving, supportive parents I always craved. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my silver fountain pen. The cool metal felt heavy against my fingers. I placed it on the table right next to my leather-bound ledger. Evelyn saw the movement. Her sobbing hitched, and a desperate flicker of hope illuminated her tear-stained face. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate gratitude. Richard finally lifted his head, his eyes tracking my movements with a hungry, pathetic anticipation. My hand hovered over the silver barrel. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sound of my own shallow breathing. The sum of $150,000 was sitting in my operating reserves. I could authorize the wire transfer with a single signature and end their suffering before the close of business. I could play the savior and absorb their shame, just as I had done countless times before. But as my fingers grazed the cold metal of the pen, I looked past my weeping mother and my silent father. My gaze settled on the grease-stained apron resting in the shadow box behind them. The tension in the room coiled tight, waiting for my defining decision. My fingers brushed the cool metal barrel of the silver fountain pen. The silence in the executive boardroom stretched taut and fragile, waiting for the scratch of ink on paper that would save the Palo Alto estate. I looked at Evelyn, whose tear-streaked face held a desperate, calculating hope. I looked at Richard, staring at the wide plank hardwood floor, waiting for his daughter to absorb his catastrophic failure. Then I looked past them, focusing on the framed grease-stained apron mounted on the wall. The contrast between my past exhaustion and their current entitlement clarified my vision. Writing that check would not buy me a loving family. It would merely fund a hostage situation. Bailing them out would validate every toxic choice they ever made, teaching them that cruelty carried no actual consequences, as long as they could extract resources at the final hour. I pulled my hand back. I picked up the pen, capped it with a sharp, definitive click, and returned it to the inside pocket of my blazer. I closed the leather-bound corporate ledger and slid it across the live-edge oak table, safely out of reach. The sudden movement shattered the quiet anticipation in the room. Evelyn gasped a short, sharp intake of air. The hope drained from her features, replaced by a raw, unvarnished terror. Richard finally lifted his head. His eyes darted from the closed checkbook to my face, his jaw working as he tried to process the rejection. He opened his mouth, perhaps to demand the funds or invoke some twisted paternal authority, but I did not give him the space to speak. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, holding my father's gaze. "I cannot help you," I said, keeping my vocal tone level and clinical. "I am sorry, Dad, but I am just a dishwasher. My margins are too tight to bail out a Stanford man." The words landed with the precision of a surgical scalpel. I fed his exact phrasing from the graduation party, back to him stripping away the country club arrogance he had worn that afternoon. Richard flinched as if struck physically. The humiliation of hearing his own insult, repurposed as the reason for his financial demise, caused his face to flush a deep, mottled red. His pride, fractured but not broken, flared into brief indignation. He gripped the armrests of his chair, muttering that I was vindictive, that I was holding a grudge, while my own parents faced public ruin. I let his anger burn out in the open air, without interrupting. "This is not revenge," I corrected him, my voice remaining detached. "This is a boundary. You committed wire fraud to protect an illusion. You leveraged your home to hide your commercial failures. Handing you $150,000 will not cure the disease rotting the foundation of your life. It will only delay the inevitable symptom." Evelyn buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with fresh, uncontrolled sobs. She knew the truth of my assessment. The Palo Alto house was already lost. The country club memberships were gone. The superficial armor they used to navigate the world had dissolved, leaving them exposed to the consequences of their actions. I waited for Evelyn to quiet down to a manageable rhythm before I presented my final offer. I told them I would not issue a bailout to the bank. I would not pay their outstanding legal fees. But I refused to let them drown without throwing a specific, structured lifeline. "I have a single non-negotiable compromise," I stated, drawing their attention back to the present. "I will not fund your lifestyle, but I will fund your recovery. Evelyn, your fear of poverty drove you to try and destroy my medical license. You are operating out of severe, unaddressed trauma. I will pay for a licensed specialist to treat your post-traumatic stress." Evelyn lowered her hands, looking at me through swollen, bloodshot eyes. A glimmer of relief washed over her, assuming I meant a high-end concierge therapist in Marin County or San Francisco, where she could hide her shame behind a polished waiting room. But true healing requires confronting the origin of the wound. I have already selected the provider. I continued outlining the strict parameters of the arrangement. She is a highly rated trauma specialist who focuses on generational poverty and survival conditioning. I will cover the full cost of an intensive year-long outpatient program. The clinic will wire the payments directly to the medical office. Not a single dollar of cash will ever touch your personal accounts. I paused, letting the structural rigidity of the offer sink in. I wanted them to understand that the era of financial enmeshment was permanently over. There is one condition I added, the weight of the moment settling over the oak table. The specialist I selected operates her practice out of Bakersfield. The name of the city hung in the boardroom, heavy and inescapable. Bakersfield, the sprawling agricultural hub in the Central Valley. The exact geographic epicenter of my mother's childhood trauma. The dusty, sweltering town she had spent 4 decades trying to outrun, utilizing expensive zip codes and luxury cars to distance herself from the memory of picking table grapes. To get the psychological help she desperately needed, Evelyn would have to physically return to her roots. She would have to drive through the sprawling farmlands, breathe the dry valley air, and confront the very soil that shaped her deepest fears. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I was offering her the keys to genuine healing, but she had to walk through the door of her own past to retrieve them. Evelyn stared at me, the gravity of the condition settling over her posture. I anticipated resistance. I expected her to reject the offer out of sheer pride, refusing to step foot in the Central Valley. But the woman sitting across from me had reached her breaking point. The Palo Alto facade was dead. She had nothing left to protect. Slowly, painfully, Evelyn nodded her head. The gesture was small, a quiet surrender to the reality of her situation. She accepted the terms. Richard sat frozen beside her, realizing his wife had just agreed to dismantle the remaining fragments of their curated existence. He tried to interject, arguing that driving to the valley every week was an unreasonable burden, but Evelyn placed a firm hand on his wrist, silencing him. The dynamic between them shifted in that instant. The illusion of his control was gone. The meeting concluded without any dramatic embraces or tearful reconciliations. It was a heavy, necessary severing of our toxic ties. I stood up from the table, signaling that our time was over. My assistant entered the room to escort them out of the suite, leading them back through the serene lobby and out into the fading afternoon sun. I remained in the boardroom alone, looking out the large windows at the Sonoma vineyards. The crushing weight of playing the family savior had lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a profound, clean clarity. I had survived the storm and secured my territory, leaving a quiet open space where the future could finally begin. A full year passed, bringing the kind of quiet that follows a devastating storm. There was no magical holiday reunion. We did not gather around a mahogany table to carve a turkey and pretend the past was merely a misunderstanding. Real life rarely mirrors the neat resolutions of daytime television. Healing requires distance, and sometimes that distance becomes permanent. The California Coastal Commission finally issued their approval, exactly 14 months after my initial filing. The bureaucratic gridlock broke, allowing my contractors to pour the foundation for the new inpatient wing. I stood in the central courtyard of the wellness retreat, under the warm Sonoma sun, holding a pair of ceremonial scissors. The scent of wild lavender and dry earth carried on the afternoon breeze. My staff surrounded me, smiling and clapping as the heavy silk ribbon fell to the stone patio. Local community leaders and neighboring vineyard owners attended the celebration, acknowledging the vital mental health resources the clinic provided to the county. I looked at the sleek modern architecture of the new facility, designed to house vulnerable patients seeking genuine recovery. It was a monument to endurance, standing on the exact dirt where my parents had once predicted my total ruin. Connor attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing in the back row, wearing faded denim and a simple cotton shirt. The designer suits and the hollow Stanford prestige were gone. After legally emancipating himself from our father's financial control, Connor relocated to Santa Cruz. He rented a cramped studio apartment located above a loud, busy intersection near the boardwalk. He secured a job shaping custom surfboards for a local shop, spending his days covered in fiberglass dust and smelling of saltwater resin. He earned a fraction of the salary the San Jose Tech Incubator had promised him, but the transformation in his physical health was undeniable. The sickly gray pallor vanished, replaced by a deep coastal tan. His shoulders relaxed. The frantic, hunted energy that defined his existence in Palo Alto evaporated entirely. Every other Sunday, Connor drove his weathered truck up the scenic highway, one coastline, to have lunch with me in Sonoma. We sat on the patio of a local bakery, eating fresh sourdough and talking about everything except venture capital. During one of those quiet Sunday afternoons, he revealed a final truth that fundamentally altered my understanding of the past year. It was a surprising twist that explained the sheer velocity of our father's sudden and brutal downfall. Connor confessed that his testimony at the state administrative hearing was only the beginning of his rebellion. Before he left the courthouse that day, he took the secondary stack of fraudulent corporate ledgers and mailed them directly to the regional office of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He did not just walk away from the shell company. He acted as the anonymous whistleblower who initiated the federal inquiry. He gathered the internal emails, the falsified bank routing numbers, and the doctored investment pitches, packing them into a secure digital dossier. He knew blowing the whistle would trigger an immediate audit, guaranteeing the collapse of the tech startup and the subsequent foreclosure of the Palo Alto estate. The Golden Child chose to detonate the empire himself, prioritizing his own integrity over the toxic loyalty our parents demanded. Hearing him admit that he actively dismantled the trap designed to imprison him left me astonished and deeply satisfied. He had finally learned how to protect himself, and in doing so, he protected countless other innocent investors from falling into our father's financial web. The consequences for Richard and Evelyn were severe and inescapable. The bank executed the foreclosure on the Palo Alto mansion, evicting them from the neighborhood they worshipped. They lost the manicured lawn, the country club memberships, and the affluent social circle that defined their perceived worth. Out of options and stripped of their leverage, they downsized to a modest rented condominium in Sacramento. The transition to the sweltering inland city forced them to confront the stark reality of their new social standing without the shield of predatory wealth. Evelyn surprisingly adhered to the strict conditions of our final boardroom negotiation. Every Tuesday morning, she drove her aging sedan down Highway 99, navigating the long, flat stretch of the Central Valley to reach Bakersfield. She sat in the waiting room of the licensed trauma specialist I funded, facing the agricultural roots she had spent 4 decades trying to erase. Untangling generational poverty trauma is a grueling, ugly process. She was forced to dismantle the survival mechanisms that made her cruel, facing the terrified girl she used to be before the Silicon Valley reinvention. We did not speak on the phone, but the therapist provided me with monthly administrative updates, confirming her attendance and active participation. Evelyn was doing the heavy, painful work of confronting her ghosts. Whether that work would ever translate into a functional maternal relationship remained uncertain, but I found profound comfort knowing she was no longer weaponizing her fear against her children. Richard handled the collapse differently. Stripped of his wealth and facing mounting civil litigation from angry investors, he retreated into a bitter, isolated silence. He tried reaching out to Connor once, leaving a voicemail demanding explanations, but Connor had already changed his phone number. I had not spoken to my father in 8 months. I did not send birthday cards or inquire about his legal defense strategy. I simply let the silence stand as a permanent barrier between my peace and his chaos. I was entirely okay with that absence. Society conditions us to believe that family bonds must be salvaged at all costs, regardless of the damage inflicted. But the social logic of modern adulthood allows us to recognize when a bridge is fundamentally unsafe to cross. Walking away from a burning building is not an act of malice, it is an act of survival. Peace did not arrive through a dramatic act of vengeance. I did not find closure by punishing them into submission or forcing them to witness my ongoing success. True peace arrived the moment I realized I no longer needed to participate in their narrative. The relentless need to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me simply faded away. It was replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of running my clinic, guiding my patients, and building a life rooted in authenticity. The dishwasher narrative they tried to lock me inside was finally broken, not by my anger, but by my undeniable competence.